I don't know, it seemed like writing a book was this weird, like viscous, unachievable thing. And then I realized when I talked to people, I was like, oh, I already know how to do a lot of different parts of this. Not all of them, but it's not like starting at 0%.
I'm Charla Larston. I've been a TV writer for almost a decade, but it wasn't that long ago that quitting my day job and moving to Hollywood was nothing but a pipe dream. After lots of failures, many mistakes, and many lessons learned, I've now written for 7 TV shows, 2 features, and sold 3 TV pilots. I've done all this through imposter syndrome, burnout, and with zero roadmap. On the Working Writer podcast, I pull back the curtain on breaking in and teach screenwriters and creatives how to thrive both personally and professionally. Without further ado, let's get to work. Welcome to another episode of the Working Writer podcast. I'm your host, Charla Larston. Thank you so much for joining me once again. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to let you know about the upcoming live virtual networking workshop in Mixer I'm hosting at the Working Writer School. Now, this Mixer is for you if you don't know the first thing about networking, or if you're an introverted networker like me, or if you've just struggled to build a network. It's going to be a fun, no pressure environment where we'll learn how to network and you'll get to connect with other writers and creatives, particularly screenwriters. The link for that is going to be in the description. So click the link below and join the upcoming networking workshop. Now, today's guest is super special. Jamie Loftus is a co-host of the long-running podcast, The Bechdel Cast, and she's the author of the new book, Raw Dog, The Raw Truth About Hot Dogs. In this episode of the podcast, Jamie and I talk about her journey of cobbling together a living as a writer, and how she learned to trust herself through the creative process. Without further ado, here's my episode with Jamie Loftus. Jamie Loftus, thank you so much for joining us. Me, there's no one else on the podcast.
It's just the two of us, and I've never been happier. It's great.
I love it. It's been a very long time since I've seen you. And I don't think I've ever gotten your actual history. So I feel like this is perfect because I do like to start the podcast just asking my guest about like who they are. So I want to know where you're from, what your cultural background is, and how you grew up.
Weirdly, I'm in my hometown right now. I'm from Brockton, Mass. It's kind of a big suburb of Boston. Pretty poor. I'm a 3rd generation Brocktonian, which my family makes me say, but it's great. I really liked growing up here and had, I think, like kind of a tough time adjusting out of it. I went to college in Boston, coming out of Brockton, and it felt like this sort of protracted, I don't know, like I think like I felt very lucky where it's like I grew up with like enough, we were never hungry or anything like that, but it was very like paycheck to paycheck. And it took me so long when I was in college and like wanting to be a writer and like worked, all these jobs to be able to stay, to not have to drop out, but just like figuring out, I was like, why can these kids do shit?
How are they doing this? Yeah.
It was so disorganized. I feel still, I mean, it's like, whatever. I have empathy for my past self, but I'm still like, Jamie, you should have figured that out sooner. They just had money. Like that was the difference.
No, you're not crazy or dumb. Do you know I'm from Taunton, Mass? Have we ever talked about this? My family lives in Taunton.
Wait, is your family still in Taunton?
My family's still in Taunton. I was just there for 4th of July.
Did you ever have reason to go to Brockton? I guess there's not much of a reason.
I would go to Brockton all the time because, all the Black people are in Brockton.
That's true.
At least when I went to school here. Actually, that's a lie. Taunton actually is like pretty diverse. There's a lot of Cape Verdeans. There's a lot of like Portuguese immigrants. There's a lot of people from everywhere. But all of my like Haitian friends, there's a lot of Haitians in Brockton. Right. So I would like hang out.
I did know that at one point. I kind of forgot we were from so close together.
Yeah, me too. But I would always go to Brockton to hang with the Haitians. And of course, they had like the better like Black hair supply stores in Brockton. They were much better in Brockton than they were in Taunton because, a Portuguese population is not looking for like Kanekalon weave or anything. So that was me in Brockton.
Oh my God.
And I also went to Emmanuel College, which was really close to Emerson and a place that people
Yeah.
confuse for Emerson all the time. So we
All
basically
the
went to the
time.
same school.
Wow, we did. We were living like parallel lives.
Seriously, we really were.
I always try to like, I'm like, how do I describe Brockton? Because it's so, because I'm like, I can't describe, because I really love it there. I love it here so much, but it's like hard to talk about the city and communicate the majesty I feel about Brockton.
Absolutely.
People don't think of Massachusetts as a place with any diversity, but the South Shore is super diverse in at least in some areas.
It's super diverse. There's a lot of like, I don't know. There were a lot of Dominicans in like Lawrence, like all the Dominicans are in Lawrence, all the Haitians are in Brockton and like Randolph and like, surrounding towns in Boston. And like, it's super diverse.
Yeah.
And New England, I definitely feel like it's its own kind of like place, because even in Taunton, there's like 5th generation Tauntonians, and like you didn't want to say that, but it's like they really have been in Taunton for like 100 years, and like generation after generation, they rep it hard. And I don't hate on it. Taunton's, it's a nice, quiet little place. It's pretty.
Yeah. Someone's got to rep Taunton. It's somebody. Like same with Brock.
Yeah.
I feel like that's what I still love about New England, for all of its like extreme flaws. I just love when someone is irrationally proud to be from somewhere that like kind of sucks. Like I just love it.
You know what? I've lived in several states, including Florida. So I would say no hate to anybody who's lived in Florida, but like I would say that Massachusetts is one of the better states in the country. I would say overall, like even though it's cold, it's like whatever. Like if I ever like absolutely had to live back in the US, I would probably live in Massachusetts. It would be like between New York and Massachusetts, or like, LA, of course, but that's because all my friends are there.
Yeah, exactly.
But I love that we have such a similar upbringing and such a similar background.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, so it's a nice surprise.
I think we learned this the first time we met, but that was so long ago that I kind of forgot. Oh, I love Southern Mass heads. Wow.
I love it. Mass holes. But the thing is, now knowing that your background, which I didn't really know before, makes me even more interested to talk to you about your new book, Raw Dog, which is surprising. It's surprising. Number one is because I didn't know that you had like a journalism background. And I guess I was surprised at how deeply journalistic the writing is for Raw Dog, just because I only know you as a comedian, you know what I mean? So it's just like, wow. First of all, Jamie's like really smart. She's like a straight up journalist. And like, this is an incredibly well-researched random topic, but important, like it made me feel like I was reading like a Michael Pollan, or like, like a book about the history of food and culture and all these other things. So,
so nice.
I want to get into this book because I'm like deeply interested at like the whole thing that you're doing. I saw you on Oprah's book club. Like I saw you on Oprah. I mean, not the book club, the actual website. They listed your book. So I have mad questions about like, how did you pull that? All these things. So first, I want to know, what was the initial like impulse to do this? Was it an actual interest in hot dogs, or did you just want to travel and this kind of like came, this kind of resulted from that?
Yeah, it was kind of both, honestly. Like it was that I had, like, I'm not a formally trained journalist. Like I didn't go to school for it or anything like that. But it was something that like I grew up around because my dad, you're from the South Shore. My dad worked at the Patriot Ledger. He was a sports writer there. And so like I don't know, like even when I was like getting interested in comedy writing, my dad was very like, wanted me to like know how to write in an informed way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was like, I grew up with an interest in it at least. And I think I kind of took more to writing than to the sporting side of what he did. But yeah, so I always was interested in it. And then when the pandemic hit, I had just finished this like project called My Year in Mensa, which was like the first time that I had like blended any sort of kind of reporting. That was still mostly comedy, but it was just like, as time was going on, it was like, oh, I want to try to blend these in a way that feels fun and feels good. Because I mean, so much of it exists, and like I'm not knocking it at all, but it felt like the only way you could, do like any sort of journalism blended with comedy was very like, it was like John Oliver, it was like all those things. And I was like, well, I can't do that. Like, I would not be good at that, but I really care about both of these things. And so it was just sort of messing around and trying to find topics that felt like there was genuinely a lot to like talk about, but also was like on its face pretty silly and harmless seeming. And so hot dogs, and I just loved hot dogs. And so I was like, well, this works out great. And when I pitched it to the publisher, it was like mid 2021. And it was, I sort of asked my literary agent when I was putting it together, I was like, is there anything like I should focus on? And she's like, well, yeah, just make sure that there's a travel element, because no one has been allowed to write a travel book in like, a year and a half. So if you had a travel element, probably a better shot of getting to make the book. So it was just kind of a blend of like, it felt like things were weirdly leading up to hopefully getting to do something like that. And I feel really lucky that I got to do it.
Interesting. So this book idea kind of came as a result of kind of talking to your literary agent. So how long have you been with a literary agent? How did that relationship start?
I want to say like maybe 3 or 4 years or something like that. I didn't have agents for my first couple of years in LA. I think that didn't come together until like 2018 or 19, I think. I'd been out for a while. And there was not really a lot of interest in me in the literary way until I started doing these podcasts. And I didn't really think that I had any reason to write a book, because I felt like, I don't know, because I like thought of myself mostly as a comedian. I was like, what would I do? Write a book of essays? Like, I don't think I've been alive long enough to warrant it. So I didn't really think about it. But yeah, once I started doing the podcasts, the literary agent that I technically worked with, but we hadn't really spoken very much before, reached out and was like, the kinds of projects you're doing like could easily be translated to a book without changing the process very much, which I found to be mostly true. I mean, there's definitely a ton of differences, but it was kind of a interesting relief where it was like, oh, I don't know. I feel like I'm sure, like, have you had experiences like that where you're like, I don't know, it seemed like writing a book was this weird, like viscous, unachievable thing. And then I realized when I talked to people, I was like, oh, I already know how to do a lot of different parts of this. Not all of them, but it's not like starting at 0%. I don't know.
Well, I really want to write a book, but I don't have a concrete idea for one. And I do think it's like this, like impossible. It just seems like insane. It seems like so much work. Like that, the fact that you even said that you started this in 2021 and it, just reading, I haven't even finished reading the book yet, but like, I was like, this was in 2020. This was very recent. In my mind, it takes a decade to write any book. So I don't know. Like in my mind, I'm just like, it's going to take forever. I probably won't release my book until I'm 75 years old. So I don't know.
But
I actually am really interested to know like what the actual process is like, because I think it's so impossible, even though I know it's possible because people do it all the time.
Well, it's like, it's like you're an incredibly funny, like gifted writer. Like it's just like figuring out the format of it that felt so daunting to me. Cause I was like, okay, I know I can write, jokes, but can I write 300 pages and can it be cohesive? And it's like scaling that felt so terrifying. So to start, like, I don't know, it's interesting. I got some guidance from the editor I worked with was really awesome. And I think that she gave incredible notes, but it was mostly, I feel like so much of her job, at least with me, became like convincing me that I could finish it, because it just like felt like a constant anxiety inducing, like, is this a book? Does this make sense?
Yeah. I'm so glad. I'm not glad that was your experience, but I'm glad because I feel like that would be my experience. So like,
yeah, totally.
okay.
I mean, and I felt, I got super lucky where I had this amazing editor. Her name's Allie Fisher, and she'd like worked with comedians before. And I think she had like gone through this process of being like, no, you know how to do this. It's okay. I will tell you if it's bad. And like, just stuff like that. And then from there, it was just, I feel like what I lucked out with by choosing like a specific topic, because I honestly, like, if I was writing like stories from my life, I don't know how I would have narrowed it down. I feel like I got lucky with having a specific topic and then finding a way to like break it down into chunks from there. And I had done, which is kind of, I mean, I didn't think of it that way, but it was kind of how I had been approaching the podcast I'd been making, where right as I was writing the book, I was also finishing a limited series podcast, because that's what like actually paid my bills.
Nice.
Books don't pay too much. And so I had already done that, where I was like doing this podcast that was about Kathy comics. And I had broken it down into like, here are 10 aspects of this that I will go into, and it'll be 10 episodes, and that's it.
And this podcast you sold, like this was your idea, then you sold it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I had already been doing that since I started doing that in early 2020, like right before lockdown was when I started doing that. I released my first limited series independently. And then I started working with iHeartRadio just to make one of those shows a year, kind of.
Wait. So the Kathy podcast was independent, or you sold it?
No. So
what was the thing that was independent that was a limited series?
The first one I did, the one about infiltrating Mensa, was something that I like wrote. And
so you just did that by yourself?
Yeah. And then I have been doing, I mean, you've been an esteemed guest. I've been doing a movie podcast called the Bechtelcast. Yeah, we've been doing that forever. And iHeartRadio was like the distributor for that. And so I like but it was like not a, I mean, it was like, you know, one of the jobs that was able to cobble stuff together. But technically, like with iHeart, I had to pitch them any other ideas. And so I told them, I was like, I've been working on this like 4-episode thing. It's mostly fun. Like, I've made it myself. Do you want it? And they were like, no. I was like, okay. I just figured I was just trying to do my due diligence. They said, like, go fuck yourself. I was like, okay. And then I released it independently, and it did well. And then they sort of, it was like the luckiest thing that ever happened was that they said no. Because then when they had to like come back and be like, we changed our minds, we do want it.
Oh,
that gave me a lot of creative freedom to choose my own topics moving forward, because I had genuinely done the first one completely by myself. So that was super lucky. And from there, I got to, I made the Kathy show as the third podcast that I had done sort of in that format, like silly topic and then a bunch of hyper specific stuff to go with it. And so I started writing Raw Dog with that exact process of like, and just viewing things as chapters instead of episodes. But the challenge, so the research process was pretty similar, but the writing process was completely different.
How? Because you had someone that you had to send it to.
Yeah, like I had an editor to answer to, which whenever, like, I didn't normally clear my scripts at least thoroughly for the podcast, but it was also just like, I didn't realize this, and I want to talk to like stand-ups who have released their own book. It was really challenging. Like, I don't know, like I'd written, but I didn't even realize like how much of like what I'm trying to say is just like communicated in how you sound when you say it. So a lot of my first draft was like my editor gently and correctly saying like, I know what you're saying here, but only because I know you and I know what you sound like, but you need to communicate it without your voice. Like, and so that I think was like the toughest, and I still think I could have done a better job at it. Like, I think it's much easier to understand the book if you've like heard me talk, or like, which ideally you wouldn't have to. So I that's still something that I want to get better at. But I didn't realize when I was writing the podcast scripts that it was like kind of a shortcut and a gift that I was like, well, I know how I'm going to say it. So hopefully it's going to come across the way I need it to, or I can add in some sort of sound indication or whatever it is, like just all the production elements that can get my point across. But when you just have like, Times New Roman to communicate it, it's way harder. I don't know how people do it. It was so hard.
I know, but it's really well communicated. I definitely think you still get your personality out throughout the book, obviously. And I don't know if it would make sense without your voice. I think your voice is like super clear in that book, and it doesn't feel stripped down to me. But I guess this is the first time I'm reading your writing. I think this is the first time I'm reading your writing. So yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad it feels that way. It felt like, I mean, especially like the further back the drafts went, it was like, I forget why I had to like go back to an earlier draft to pull something like a month ago, but I was like, oh yeah, this is like kind of incoherent in some places.
How many drafts did you have to do?
I had to do 3 drafts.
Of the entire book?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then I feel like I ended up doing like more like 4. I mean, the 3 drafts are the official ones with my editor. Like she reads the book 3 times, and then hopefully at the end it doesn't suck.
Yeah.
But I also like talked to, I mean, honestly, most like before I turned in my first draft, because I turned in my first draft late. But I turned it in even later than expected because I feel like the closest thing I had to a writing mentor when I was growing up was my dad, just because he liked that I was doing it, even though it wasn't like the same kind of thing. And so I knew that he like worked in like very straightforward journalism. So I sent him the first draft as like, can you tell me what sentences don't make sense before I show it to my editor, who I think is cool, and I don't care if you think I'm cool.
Right.
It ended up being more like 4 drafts where it was like a cleanup and then sort of 3 drafts for content.
Oh, so your dad was your first reader. Very cool.
My dad was my first, yeah. And I think also my last, but I don't think I listened on any of the last ones. I was like, it has to be done.
Do you think that his eyes on it first was super helpful before turning it into your editor?
Yeah, I think it was like it was comforting to know that someone else had read it already and didn't like, I appreciate, because I don't know, like I just trust his opinion and think that like he would not hesitate if it was a disaster to like let me know. So after reading it, after he read it and like sent me mostly like actual like, grammatical confusing, like it was just this whole marked up thing where it was like,
yeah,
is this a joke from you, or can you add punctuation that makes sense? And sometimes it would be one, sometimes it would be the other, but it was like, okay, someone has read this. It's someone whose opinion I trust. And also it was kind of nice that it was like someone who was like not anywhere near my age, because I was also afraid that it would be inaccessible in that way. So it was nice to have him look over it first.
That's great.
Yeah, it was fun.
So you said at the beginning that like you didn't even know like how this book would come together. How did you get to the point where you're like, okay, this is the idea? Like you and your literary agent, or you and an editor, like did you have to write like a proposal, and from that proposal you guys were like, all right, this feels like it's a solid idea now, we can move forward?
Yeah, I did write a proposal that was sort of based off of like proposals that I'd done for podcasts already, where it was, I knew I wanted it to be hot dogs. I sort of like took the temperature with my literary agent to be like, is this even worth pitching, or will people think it is too stupid? Um, and I like it. Yeah, it was like a combination of like, I sort of pitched out like, this is why I think there should be a book about hot dogs. There hasn't been any in 15 years. No one's ever written about them like critically and celebratory in the space of the same book, just stuff like that. And then I just listed out, here are, I think originally I only ended up using 10, I think, in the book, but it was like 15, like here are 15 different angles into this topic. And I think they would all be interesting and could exist in the same book. So that was sort of the shape of the pitch when I sent it in.
All right. So pitch feels like it's a lot of like justifying why this book should be a thing.
Yeah, it was completely defensive.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about like the actual process of writing the book. I want to take a quick break, but then when we come back, I want to talk about like the process of writing the book.
Cool.
You know, I talked to you about my fear of like writing a book. I think it's just like my procrastinating brain, just like not wanting to do work or do hard things,
Yeah.
which I totally sympathize with my brain on that, but I still want to achieve things.
She's right about it.
So she's right. What did the process look like for you? Like literally, how did you write this book?
Part of it had to do with the topic. Others didn't. Like I knew that because I also like, it's weird. I like working by myself. I like doing a mix of like, even if I'm in a writer's room, I need like a side project that's like, I can be alone and I don't need to take a million opinions on everything. I just feel like that balance is good for my brain for whatever reason. But I was afraid of working alone on something so big for it felt like so much time, even though it really wasn't. But I was so used to like the podcast, like I was putting together projects of the same length in half the time. So I'm like, this is so much time. I have to get it perfect, and I'm going to be alone for so much of it. And like I was dreading it. So I decided to start with kind of the fun part. And I didn't write a word until I had gone on my research trip. So I sort of planned the second the agreement went through, and they're like, okay, you're going to write this book. Here's when we want it done by, which basically meant I was like, oh, so I have to leave like soon. They're like, yeah, you should probably start doing research in the next 2 weeks. So it was like it's scary and exciting at the time, where it's like the first leg was just like planning logistics, finding hot dogs I wanted, renting a car, and like going. So it started with the fun part. And as we were on this trip, it was just like a combination of like, I took some notes, I recorded a lot of voice memos and took a lot of pictures, and then would sort of like sort that by day, because we were going to so many places. I was like, I'm going to forget shit. So it was like vague. It was not like intense note taking, but it was a combination of stuff. And so that was the first whole leg. And then once I'd finished the research parts, it was like 4 solid months of writing, maybe a little less than that.
It's not that long.
Yeah. I feel like I blocked some of it out. It was like pretty miserable at that time.
And where did you do it? Did you go home to do the writing, or were you in LA?
Oh, I was in LA for most of the writing. Yeah, because I had been home for a good chunk of the summer. I was like finishing the Kathy podcast in Massachusetts. My dad was having some health stuff, so I was home with him. And by the end of the summer, it was like, ooh, I have to get started on this. And I just want to get home. So I went back to LA. My boyfriend and I broke up almost immediately. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, I'm like alone. And so the book, like, I don't know, it's very, whatever, a very specific problem, but it ended up being like the best and the worst part of this chunk of months, where it was like something that was urgent and I had to focus on, but it also, for me, like, hopefully not as much for the book, even though it's like referenced, but was like living inside of like the 2 months where my relationship was super failing for months on end. And it was like, I don't know, I felt very trapped in summer 2021, but also it was very motivating because I'm like, the sooner I finish this book, the sooner I don't have to live there anymore. And so it was pretty much full time working on that for a couple of months after I got home. I think it was like September was when I got back. And then I turned in the first draft sometime in January.
What helped you the most to do it, other than the fact that you desperately wanted to leave your apartment? And was it the deadline? What was it that helped you like really finish this book?
It was the deadline. I was very, I don't know. I mean, I felt like fraudulent even writing a book at all. Like, and no one knew still, like it had, I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody about it. So I felt a lot of, it's weird. I didn't feel like pressure from the publisher or anything. I just felt like I was so worried that I would fuck it up, that it was very motivating to like try to do it in a way that felt true to who I was, and hopefully in a way that would read to other people. So it was like a very, I don't know, like feeling like I needed to prove something. And it was also just like, it turned out that I knew it going in, but the more that I learned about hot dogs and a lot of like the people that I had met, and a lot of the, I mean, like positive and negative stuff that I'd bumped up against, I was like, oh, I think I got like so lucky where I was like, I really did not ever get sick of the topic for a second. Like, I didn't dread learning more about hot dogs really ever. It was more just like worrying that I wouldn't be the right person to do it.
What was the most interesting thing you learned about hot dogs, about yourself, and maybe about your boyfriend on this trip?
I learned that my ex didn't like mustard, and that was a weirdly gigantic hindrance to communicating with hot dog people all day long. They really hate to hear that you don't like mustard, especially in Chicago. There's just a lot of places where that is not an acceptable opinion. But as far as, I mean, what I learned, and I knew this in the abstract because it had been a part of my pitch of like, like how are they produced, and like how do they, why are they considered to be such an American food? Like, and where does that come from? And I had those questions, and I was like, I mean, I wanted to know the answer, but the more I got into it, I was like, oh, it was like a very juicy, complicated question. And I really, really enjoyed sort of teasing that question out more. And I feel like the more questions I had led to there's also so many sub communities to explore. Yeah. This was like one of the least pleasant parts of the research, but it was something that I was like, oh, wow, I have barely seen this discussed in a large public sense of, how meatpacking factories were kept open by executive order during lockdown. And just the incredible cost of life that took on people who work in plants, and looking into why meat packers used to have really strong unions and don't have as strong unions anymore. Like, there were all of these stories that felt, I don't know, I thought I would be talking more about the past than I actually ended up talking about it. I thought I would be going like, these meatpacking unions in like the jungle days. Like, I thought I would be talking about the Industrial Revolution a lot. Yeah. And I did, but it was like, there was so much more to talk about that was happening as I was like developing, as I was writing it, that ended up really, I mean, I still feel like I wish I was like, ooh, if the book didn't come out for another year, I could have talked about this, and this. Like, it's such a developing story that most people don't, including me, like have much of I guess, desire or feel that there's not much of a need to follow it, but it's incredible. And I really loved, just getting to learn about it, and also just getting to learn about people who worked in meatpacking and wanted to change that. So it ended up being like all these really cool union stories, and some devastating ones as well. And then I also got to learn about competitive eaters, and it turns out like I've been looking for my sport my whole life. That I'm like, I will tune in.
Yeah.
I will buy shirts. Like, I just never found a sport that I loved watching. And it turns out it's competitive eating.
That's
so that was
amazing.
also great for me.
That's amazing. What an interesting trip. I do think what you said about it becoming a story about unions and about like a very current story. Recently, I read in the news about like, child labor in these meatpacking plants. It's definitely something you don't think you're going to see in modern times.
Right.
But it is like a shadow industry or something. They have so much power. I don't know if any of it changes our meat consumption. Like, are you a meat eater? I mean, you are. You ate hot dogs.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is like, that's the thing that I still have trouble squaring. And I'm like, I don't, maybe I genuinely am not the person to write about this, but I hope somebody does. Is like, I learned so much awful stuff about how meat is produced, and it definitely, I eat less meat than I used to, but I just felt I was like kind of disappointed in myself, because I felt so sure. I was like, well, when this project is done, I'm going to have to research all this stuff, and I will be at least a vegetarian by the time this book comes out. And it just did not happen. Like, I'm more discerning about the meat I eat, but I still eat it. And I'm like, well, what the fuck has to go wrong in your brain for that to be true?
I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know, but I don't know what else we could do aside from eat it responsibly.
Yeah.
Even fish, I feel awful eating when like you read about like the overfishing and like these populations decreasing and like all this other stuff. I'm just like, it just always feels like, what can we do as individuals? Which always makes me feel like this doesn't feel like an individual problem. It feels like a real collective problem.
Right.
Which is the other part of your book, which is like, it has a political bend to it, which I think is part of your personality, because you do mention early that you're a socialist, and then you say like, don't put the book down, please. Which I thought was really funny.
Thank you.
Did you encounter any kind of like politics on your travels? Because I feel like it's hard not to travel through the US and not encounter some politics.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's part of what I thought was really interesting. Was we were traveling at a time where, in retrospect, would I have traveled during this time had I known? Like, if it was such a specific, like, summer 2021, we had just gotten our like second dose of the vaccine. It was like, okay, we're masking, but it's okay, we're back. Which now we know we were actually very much not back.
Yeah.
And there was still, a whole like two more. We started traveling right before the Delta variant. So we were sort of like trying to stay, 2 steps ahead of this virus that's impossible to stay ahead of.
Yeah.
So, whether we liked it or not, it was impossible to avoid, wherever we were. It was easy to tell how people felt about it. Some regions were cautious, other regions weren't cautious. So, I mean, there was definitely like COVID politics all over the place. And then the other thing that we would encounter on a daily basis was sort of the lead in to like the Great Resignation towards the end of 2021. And so I think that, we still hear it now, but it was like right when I started hearing all the time, like, no one wants to come back to work. No one likes working anymore.
Yeah.
And so it was that, because it was like all of these really small businesses who mostly employed, young people, and young people had been radicalized over the last year and a half. And they were like, why would the fuck would I come back here? And so it was interesting seeing how businesses would react to that. And some would react with frustration. Others would react by trying to figure out, like, well, how can I provide my employees what they need and what they're asking for based on what I have? And like, it was a really interesting time to be going around, because it's like you are just eating hot dogs, but sometimes you go to a hot dog place and they're like, no one came back, so now I work 90 hours a week. And you're like, holy shit, that sounds bad, but don't yell at the kids,
Right.
So yeah.
It did feel like a docuseries at points. Do you think that this is something that you might want to do a video companion to?
I would love to. Yeah, I keep waiting to get sick of hot dogs, and it just like does not happen. Yeah, I think that there's like certain things. I wonder, I don't know. Now I'm just like, how many formats can I talk about hot dogs in?
Yeah, there's a podcast in there, and there's like a Netflix series in there.
I hope so. Yeah, that would be cool. I mean, there's certain things where it's like, it was really fun to be like, oh, how can I describe in words? How can I do justice to like what Joey Chestnut does on ESPN? Like, how do I describe a man eating 76 hot dogs?
Mm-hmm.
But there are some things where you're like, you really, unfortunately, do have to just look at it with your eyes and take it in and feel however you want to feel.
Right. I wanted to ask you about promoting this book, because I'm seeing it everywhere.
Hell yeah.
I want to know how much of that is you and how much of that is your publisher.
It's a blend. I mean, my publisher was really supportive, and like their promotion department, which is just like two women that I worked with who were both great. They reached out to me, I think before I even turned in the final draft, and asked, just sort of asked me like how I would feel comfortable promoting it, which I really appreciated and wasn't really expecting. But they were like, it's like, this book is your voice, and so we don't want to shove you into situations that would feel weird, because that doesn't help anybody and sucks for you. So they knew that, I mean, part of the reason I got to write the book was because of podcasts. And so we sort of just started there of like stuff like that. I think I got lucky where on the press side, it was they timed the release super well, where it was just like the beginning of summer. And so people were kind of looking for summer food stories anyways. And then I think on my end, what I contributed was like all I talked about for 2 years before the book came out was like, I had not shut up about hot dogs for a very long time. And I was wondering, I was kind of hoping that people would be like excited to read it by the time it came out and not just like sick of it. But yeah, I think it was like, I don't know that it was an even split, because the promotions department at the publisher were super proactive. And they also let me go on a full book tour, which I know is not, especially since lockdown, is like a difficult sell. But I was pushing for it because I was like, well, so much of what I do is performance, and I would love to build out like hot dog variety shows, and like I just like wanted to have fun and have them be regionally specific. Like I programmed those all myself. They like, paid for me to travel and do it, but I got to, I mean, they let me go to 8 cities, and I got to, book local hot dog companies to like cater the events. I got to, they gave me a lot of freedom to sort of promote it in a way that felt comfortable for me. And I feel like it ended up helping. I hope it did.
I mean, it certainly did. I mean, I know about it, and I'm barely looking for anything. So
perfect.
Like, oh, this popped up. I wanted to ask about getting your agent, because you said it in a way that was very like matter of fact. Like, I did podcasts, and then they reached out to me, and then I got a literary agent. But yeah, there are people out there who really want literary agents, and they're just like, I have no idea how to get one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Was it straight up just the fact that you had work out there and then somebody literally approached you, or were you putting out feelers and the fact that you had podcasts and like other work out there helped? Was it really truly someone reached out to you and was like, you should write a book? Or was it straight up, you were like, I need reps?
That varied. I think I struggled to get reps when I first came out to LA. I had like a manager had reached out to me when I was like 22 off of this stand-up clip that had appeared on basic cable in, I think, the DC area. I don't even know why the DC area, but I ended up getting a manager. But even with that relationship, it was so like I was almost losing my manager all the time, like for years.
Why? Because you weren't producing enough work or something? Or you weren't booking?
No, I was so confused. I mean, also I was like a very chaotic like person in my early 20s, but I was so confused because I was making stuff all the time. Like I was like medically manic, like making shit constantly. But the feedback I would get, even when like, I don't know, there's like a few goofy, very mid 2010s like internet projects I did, and they would get clickbait written about them. And like, those would be fun. And I would always sort of be like, do you like this? Like, to send it to my manager, be like, do you like this? And the feedback that I would get for the first couple of years is like, this is like, where is this going? Like, it's unfocused. It's too much. It's like, I was getting the feedback of too much, pretty consistently. And, I don't know. So I felt like I was left to my own devices in a way that was like, creatively fun, but felt like it was never going to go anywhere. And so, yeah, it was sort of a slow, bizarre process. I worked on an animated show after someone reached out to me on Twitter. And that was sort of how I started writing in animation. And it was just cobbling together, like doing live shows where I could, writing on Robot Chicken for like $14, which is not exactly true, but like pretty fucking close.
All right.
The way that I had to make the rest of the money was that I would write for those clickbait websites. And like that was something that I had always done to sort of make ends meet, because there was still kind of a market for it. And the way, I don't know, I feel like this was sort of a whole era of millennial women writing. I don't know how any of it will hold up in the big picture, but it was sort of like, I went to this place and something a little weird happened. And so, and for some reason, there was a point in time where that shit would do numbers.
Yeah.
So I was writing stuff like that too. So it was just like doing a lot to cobble together a cohesive living, without having to go back and working at a bookstore, which is what I was doing before. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't until, but like, no, I don't know. Like when I got Robot Chicken and I was like, okay, now at least my manager felt I had reason to see if I could find a TV writing agent, which still took about a year, but eventually was like, okay, it happened. And that was at UTA. And so they have just like gigantic infrastructure. And we're like, yeah, if we have reason to get to, introduce you to other people, we will, but you got to do something. And so it really was like that, rejection from iHeartRadio, because that Mensa piece had started as the clickbait I was just describing, where it was like, I went to a Mensa conference and people fucking hated me. Hopefully it was like a little above, but that's very much the format of what it was. And when I finished that project, which I had netted, I think like $250 cumulatively, I'd written like 5 pieces for nothing. But I just like wanted to bring it all together in something. So I wrote this huge essay and I was like, I showed it to my manager and I'm like, what do you think? Like, should I try to sell this somewhere or whatever? And she's like, no, it's too much. It's too long. And she suggested that I turn it into a podcast instead. And that was like how and I think that I also benefited from the timing of when I did that. Like it was a fair amount of luck. It was, I mean, definitely a lot of years of frustration and being told that it's like too much, not working, too like either too specific or too broad or too gross or whatever. But I lucked out with the timing of when that came out, where I think still less so now, but I think it before all the famous people truly got to podcasting. I think in a way that I benefited from like executive confusion about like why things worked versus why things didn't. And I lucked out where something that, you know, people told me would not work ended up working. And they were like, oh, I guess we'll just do that again. Do that again with something else. We don't care what it is. And so then it was like, okay, I will try. And did it with a second show that was all about the book Lolita. So it was like a very depressing version of that same process. And it was making those podcasts is the only reason that I got to write the book. And it was because the editor had heard my year in Mensa and at least liked the, I guess, potential of it. Cause I love it. I love making that show, but it's kind of a mess. Like I edited it myself on iMovie. So it's like not technically beautiful, but I like, she saw potential in it and was like, I think that this could be a book. So it just was a lot of experimenting and trial and error and being rejected and then finishing it anyways.
I love that. Are you rich now?
No, but I don't have to cobble 4, you know, creative things at a time to make a living, which is like,
that's wealth.
Feels crazy. Yeah. I was like, wow, I could like take a week off and I wouldn't die.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's great. It's really lucky. I'm still, you know, making long form podcasts and stuff like that. Not the market it used to be, but it's still, you know, it's still kicking. And I feel lucky that it was like, it felt like a long sort of frustrating fight to just be like, please trust me that this is interesting and like, give me some time and some space and I will do my best to make it interesting. And it feels like this book was like an example of like having that trust. And I was really happy with how it worked out.
How fantastic. So what's next for you?
I don't know. That's like I wish I had a good answer. I'm finishing another podcast right now. That'll come out before the end of the year. That's like a totally different topic. So I'm enjoying that. It's very stressful. So I'm finishing that up. And I would love to write another book, but I think now I'm sort of worried. It's a great problem to have, but I'm sort of worried about getting stuck in the like very specific topic deep dive. Like I love doing it, but I think if I did it forever, I would walk into the ocean at some point.
Right, so. Right. Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're not somebody that is afraid to, I guess, fail and say no and see if you can pivot.
That's my 2 favorite things.
Yeah. 2 favorite things are failing and saying no.
Yeah.
What advice would you give yourself for your next project, I guess?
I know it'll end up happening anyways, and maybe accepting it is like a part of it, but it's just like, I want to be better at, and I feel like I work better when I just trust myself and I feel like most times, like not completely, but most times when someone tells me like, this would be a great topic for you and here are all the reasons it makes sense and blah, blah, blah. Anytime I have gone with someone else's instinct about what I would be good at, I'm not good at it and not happy. And so it's, I think just like trusting my instincts of, even if I don't completely know how it's going to look or like whatever, it's like, if I am excited about it, that's the most important thing. So I think it's just, I don't know. It's nice to have people who like want to help and like technically it's part of their job to be like, this would be good for you, but not forcing stuff that doesn't feel good. And that I feel super lucky that I'm in a position where I don't have to force stuff that doesn't feel good as much as I used to.
That trusting yourself thing is huge. I feel like it's a thing for like writing any kind of work, is like helping people believe in themselves.
Totally.
So much of the creative process is like the mindset that you come to it with. And I feel like obviously experiencing, trusting somebody or listening to somebody and that not working out like over and over gets you to a point where you're like, you know what, maybe I just need to like trust myself and listen to myself.
Yeah.
But is there any other way to, I guess, get to the point where you trust yourself other than, trial and error of like listening to other people?
The other thing that I would always try to do is like, because when I was younger, I feel like I would always compare myself to everybody, anybody at any time. And it was like an uglier side of my personality, and also accomplished nothing in terms of, like it didn't make me any better as a person or as a writer or as anything. And so it was like, and it took a while, but eventually when it was like, oh, I need to like look to people who are doing work that is important to them and experiencing success with it, even if it's not what you would think of as like an algorithmically successful thing, like, and get inspired and excited by that. So it was like also just sort of finding people that were doing stuff that was really, really specifically their own and figured it out. And so I was sort of like on a tear of like looking at just anyone, like whether they were comedians or writers or whatever, filmmakers, whatever it was, that like had been doing it for a while and then figured it out at some point. Because I used to put so much pressure on myself of like, how long do you have to figure it out?
Which always works.
Which definitely sped up the process. I just know it.
Yeah.
Changing that like criticism and turning it into like curiosity. And I think that was helpful. And just, I don't know, like just remembering like I love what I do and I'm super lucky to do it. And if I suck at it, no one dies. And that is right. So lucky. Like,
thank God. Yeah. I think this is so great. And I agree. It feels that what you're talking about, underneath all that, like not being too mean to yourself, not too much negative self-talk, a little bit more self-compassion, a little bit more patience with yourself, a little bit more accepting where you are and where you're at, and the fact that you're not like a perfect, amazing writer yet is really helpful. It's been helpful for me, and it sounds like that's part of the process for you too. So super cool. Excellent book, Jamie. I can't wait to finish it.
Thank you.
Just so much fun.
Thank you for reading it.
Oh my God. I felt like I have to. Like, first of all, it's called Raw Dog, number one, which is, I was like, oh, I got to read this. And it truly is super inspiring whenever any of my friends or colleagues or acquaintances like writes a book, because it makes me feel like I can do it. And I'm definitely one of those people that is like, am I ever going to write this book? As soon as I have an idea, I'll write a book. But I mean, let's see.
You're such an amazing writer. Like, you're so funny. You're such an amazing writer.
You're so sweet.
But it's like, I don't know. When I was reading other books, I was like, wow, right? Or even like when I think it was more when I was planning my book tour. I was like, okay, what do other author events look like? And they fucking suck. They're so boring, right? Like,
boring, dude.
Most people who write books are like humorless.
Yeah.
I didn't realize. I was like, wow, it's so like you have a leg up by just like knowing who you are and having a personality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know. I'm excited to read your book.
Oh my God, stop. Well, thank you so much, Jamie, for coming on the podcast.
Of course.
Absolute pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. This is so much fun.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. That's all I've got for now. Until next time, get out there, get to work. This episode was edited by Justin Asher and executive produced by me, Charlotte Larston. Thanks for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe.